Welcome to part 3 of the day 2 code for the Randomizer Project. So today we are going to quickly review the dice runner that we created in the previous lesson, and then we're going to move on to a more advanced version that creates what we'll call a dice bag, or a bag of dice that we can put multiple dice in and then operate on using arrays. So first, once we've written the class for an object, we want to actually turn the class into an object. We do that by instantiating an object using the new keyword and then calling a constructor method. Now, when we're declaring an object, we start by specifying the class of the object, followed by a name of a variable, the equals operator, because we're going to be assigning this variable a value, and that value comes by calling the constructor. The job of the constructor is to initialize any instance variables and get the object ready for us to use. In the case of a six-sided die, which we're calling a D6, the constructor initializes the die with a random value. So we can then call methods for that object. We can now call it an object because we've actually instantiated it. You instantiate a class, and then you have an object, an instance of that class. So once I've instantiated the object, I can use the methods for that object. So on this line of code, for example, we're getting the current face value of the object, which is just a number represented as a string. Then we went ahead and we rolled the die 10 times, outputting the result each time. So now let's move on to working with multiple objects. So we're going to create a new class, which we're going to call our dice bag runner. And the dice bag runner is going to create multiple dice, which we can then roll and calculate the total of. So we're going to start by filling in our java.comment, which will include a description. This class will create a dice bag of six-sided dice that we will roll and total. Okay, so let's get to work after we fill in our name, and we're going to use the date for our version number, February 13th, 2015, the date this code was written. Okay, so what do we need to do? Well, first, we're going to be working with a group of dice. And one way to represent a group of the same or similar objects in Java is to create an array. When we declare an array, we always use the format type followed by square brackets, the name of the array, and then the keyword new, followed by the type listed again, and then the size of the array in square brackets. So for example, if I was creating an integer array, I would say int square bracket sum ints equals new int 10. And I now have an array of 10 integers. Well, the process is exactly the same for creating an array of D6s, except that my type is the name of the class. It's still an array, and then I have to come up with a name. I'm going to say that these are dice, the plural of die. Okay, so I've got my dice, and then I'm going to say equals new, and then I'm now going to specify the type again and how many dice I want. We're going to start with a small number that traditionally used to calculate attributes for Dungeons and Dragons, 3 six-sided die, which will then add the total. Now, we're not actually using this int array, so we're just going to go ahead and delete that line. All right, now, the curious point here and an often common point of confusion is to think that this statement has called the constructor for a d6 3 times. And be very careful with this, it has not. What this has done is created an array of d6s that has three elements. And when you create a new array, just like if it was an array of strings, what value would be stored in each element of the array? The special value null. And we can demonstrate that by writing a simple loop for int, let's say die, for int die index equals 0, die index is less than dice.length, die index plus plus. Okay, and then I'm just simply going to do a system out dot println dice die index. Now, if we run this, what do we expect to see as our output? And what we should see is 3 nulls. Because notice that these dice have not been instantiated yet. This is an array filled with null values. So what I have to do next is actually instantiate each of my die in the dice array. So how do I do that? Well, we're going to do it manually, and it's going to seem weird. Why don't we use a loop for this? And that's going to be because of something we're going to do in a later lesson involving this class. So we're going to say dice 0 equals new d6. Now notice the difference after the keyword new here. I've not used square brackets, I'm using parentheses, which means that I'm calling a method. And what method am I calling? I'm calling the constructor for a new die, and I'm storing it in dice at index 0. Now if we run the same program, all of a sudden, magically, we have d6 equals 5. So if I want to instantiate more dice, I need to repeat the process. Whoops, not that line. So let's put in a comment here. Instantiating a new die in the dice array. Whereas here, we are creating the dice array filled with null values. Okay, so now we're going to say dice 1 equals new d6, and then we're going to say dice 2 equals new d6. And now when I run my program, I see that I actually have 3 6-sided die, which is what we were after. Okay. Having a little bit of trouble here adjusting my console size. There we go. That's a little bit better. Okay, so what do we want to do next? Well, our goal here was to create a dice bag of 6-sided dice that we roll and total. And we're going to want to do this experiment 10 times. So we're going to put a loop around this whole section of code that says for int roll num equals 1, roll num is less than or equal to 10, roll num plus plus. Now you may be asking yourself, why did you start at 1 and use less than or equal to 10? Now remember, traditionally in programming, most programmers start with 0, and then you get to use less than the actual number that you're counting up to. Why do we want to use 0? Because we're addressing an array, and the first element in the array is actually 0. But in this case, we're going to want to output something to the console, and we're going to be outputting a number that is fit for human consumption, and therefore most humans expect to see 1 as the first number. So now we're going to do a system.out.print. Notice it's not a print line, but a print. And we're going to say roll number plus roll num plus, and then we're going to put a colon. And we use a print because I don't actually want it to go to the next line. Okay, now we're going to replace this print line with something else very shortly. But first, let's do something else. Before we start going through the dice, let's create a variable that's capable of storing the total. We'll call it dice total equals 0. Okay, we're ready to go. Now, within our loop, we're going to use another convenience shortcut. And this is something that's often done within loops when you're processing objects, especially when you're going to be using an object multiple times. It's kind of inconvenient to type dice die index. So what we're going to do is we're going to declare a d6 object variable called die. Remember, dice is multiple, the singular is die, equals, and then we're going to say dice at die index. Now, please note that this does not create a new die. All this does is create a reference variable called die that is pointing to the same place as the dice at die index. This allows me to not have to type dice at die index each time I want to reference the die. Instead, I can now just use die. Okay, so what do we want to do? Well, we want to tell that die to randomize. Then we want to take the total and add the total for that die, which we do by getting the current value of the die. And then finally, we want to do a nice output that shows what the value of the die is. Now, because we did our little shortcut here, we get to just simply do die here, plus we're going to put a nice comma and space after it, and that will output the value of the die. Okay? And then finally, when our for loop ends, we're going to do a nice print line to finish the line up. We're going to say total equals plus dice total. Okay. And now we should be ready to roll our dice 10 times and observe the total of rolling all three and summing them. And look at that. Roll number 1, on my first d6 I got a 2, second d6 I got a 3, on my third d6 I got a 5. That is a total of 10. Then I got a 4, 6, and 1. What's my best roll here? Well, as you can see, so far my best total was 13. Okay, so as you can see, we're now able to store objects within an array.